Well, hey, welcome to our conversation. My name is Matt Peeples, founder and director of the Kairos Network, and lead pastor now of Faith Oakville. Transitioned with this guy, John Brunette, who is now we call you lead pastor emeritus.
Or it's just irrelevant.
And our friend Jim Galvin, who is one of the reasons we're having this conversation is there is no formal laid out in scripture structure for what governance has to be in a church. And oftentimes governance can be one of the biggest roadblocks to mission. And one of the big things I noticed when I first attended Faith is their governance structure really cleared the way for the incredible mission that we see in the community. And so in talking to John and Jim, I said, man, why is that? Why is it the governance structure you put in place here just really frees things up like that? And we had a really cool conversation that we thought would be a benefit to you as well. So guys, thanks for taking this opportunity to join us. Hey, really quickly, introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your experience.
So I'm Jim Galvin. I'm a full-time consultant focusing on strategy, governance, and leadership development. I've been doing this for 27 years now. I didn't intend to work with boards, but that's how it works out.
Yeah. So I never planned to work with boards either in a church as we grew larger. But Jim has been kind of like he's been the specialist, for me, kind of the guru, the phone call away when we had governance issues. Came to our church at least twice to work with our boards to get us on kind of online for the policy based as we were growing, and we knew we needed to change. So from the books he's written, read a couple of those, to now what we use for training. For me, he's like the professional, and I'm just like the practical guy who's put it to work and seen it work, as we've seen many transitions in size over the years of the church.
Yeah, we know it worked in practice, but does it work in theory?
Well, I tell you, that's the exciting part about this conversation because I've noticed, one, John, you've led a church that has been in a lot of these different size stages, and you've watched that growth, and you've seen a church that started with one governance structure, and then connected with Jim, and you were able to kind of move that to a different structure. So excited to lean into that experience. It's also been my experience from church planting to leading an established church to now leading a mid-sized church that, governance structure makes an impact. It makes an impact when you're smaller, medium-sized, big. And I think sometimes we underestimate the impact it makes and how our governance structure can actually change the way we do ministry, for the better or for the worse. And so excited to have this conversation really quick as we're setting the stage for this. John, what led you to first call Jim? And then Jim, what did it look like when you were first working with John and making some of those critical transitions?
I think I was introduced, Jim, you correct me, but it was through PLI. So I was the first class in 1999, and I was able to spend 2 years, 4 3-day events in different parts of the country with different, not just pastors. It was really, really cool. And it was called governance. At that point, it was called Governance Executive Training. And I have that notebook, which is about that big. And it involved things like health. It involves more than just governance executive training. But that's how I got connected. And then I realized that I think there came a point where I was like, first off, I remember the evangelism committee guy. His name was Mark. And some of you know his last name because it was Countryman. And Adam, who's leading the bands for the National Youth Gathering, and he had an incredibly wonderful dad. And I remember he was in charge of the evangelism committee, and the chairman, or as we could say, the church council chairman, looked at him and said, "Mark, what are we doing for evangelism?" And I remember the message was like, "What? we're all to be about evangelism. We've put it upon a committee, and that's how we're separating. I said, we can't operate like this, Seymour. I said, we're going to get rid of all of our committees. That was a bold statement, and then the bureaucracy level is so great. It's like, how do we make this more effective so that we can, because they would ask me I would be accountable for things. And I think I just mentioned this to you, Matt, this morning. I was accountable for things, but I had no authority to make that decision, nor was I accountable to that goal or thing they said was to happen, because I couldn't make the change. Um, I wasn't actually responsible, so I just put it back on them and said, "Well, that's actually you, because I don't have that authority to even make that change." So that was kind of some of the couple things that were really big for me.
John, I love that you said that too, because I think in this conversation we're having, there's kind of a core fear button that I hear from people, and they're afraid that they're going to give their pastor, you know, all kinds of authority and no accountability. But the reverse is actually true. Oftentimes, our pastors are stuck with all this accountability and no authority
Right.
to carry it out.
Jim, you can comment on this. What I find is that the pastors fall into a permission giving mode. Like, I have to get permission to do anything. I was talking with I won't say who, larger church, and he said, "Oh, I got permission to have another song in the opening of our worship." And I'm like, "You got permission to add it?" So you had to go through a process of, so boss, when you were saying why even talk about this now, I think because the urgency is that much greater for mission, especially in our church body, but also in these United States and in this world. So how do we take away these barriers that move us to be able to disciple and carry out mission?
So, John, how big was faith when you called Jim to start walking through this process?
Oh man, I'm guessing we were worshiping in the 400s in terms of people, and probably 1,000 to 1,200 on the books. Yeah,
So you were right in that mid-size, and we're having this
yeah.
conversation. So let's start here. Why governance matters for mid-sized churches. So Jim, you get this call from John. He's like a 400 in worship attendance, and he's got all these governance issues. Like, is this a normal call for you?
Yeah. Although with Faith Lutheran, this was one of the earliest board that I worked with. Normally, I'd be working with staff and more so early on with evangelical parachurch organizations, which would be more of a specialty for me. But yeah, what happens with churches that are growing, they're birthed, they're planted, they become a real congregation, they get some kind of a structure in their bylaws, and then if they're successful and as they grow, they outgrow their structure. Usually right around 150 or 200 in size. And their original structure when they were small was built to meet that need. And a lot of churches use the Abden model, which is a board of stewardship, board of evangelism, board of the Christian education, board of worship. And then the chairs of all those meet together to be part of the parish planning council, which means nobody's in charge. So when you're, you know, still in double digits in terms of worship, and you have a pastor and a part-time secretary, you still have to get everything a church is supposed to do. You have to do all of that ministry. And so forming committees or boards or something is sort of natural. But it wasn't always that way. Before 1960, there was no parish planning council model. So what was happening historically, I think one of three things: either you had the pastor basically running everything. The German term for that is Herr Pastor. Right? So he is the guy. He's making all the decisions. Or you have elders. They're supposed to do elder stuff, but they ended up being a decision-making body. Or you have monthly congregational meetings, and all the decisions are made there. So I think it's one of those three early on. And I don't really see any record of something else. But if churches get bigger, and some of the lay leaders say we need to get more organized, we can't do, monthly congregational meetings all the time. And then they create some kind of, well, let's have one board that deals with finances and business. Let's have one board that deals with spiritual stuff, elders. And let's have one board for our school. And it creates um, the structural trap for conflict when you have more than one group all at the same level trying to run one organization. So the way to get out of that is to have a single board that's overseeing the church, the school, the preschool, and any other ministries that you happen to have. So single board overseeing the congregation as a whole.
Yeah.
And so at some point, you have to make that shift from your old structure, whatever it was, to a single board. And somebody's going to lose power in that situation. When you have a really dysfunctional situation, the people who bang their fists on the table and yell, that's how they keep their power in those dysfunctional situations. And those are the people that are going to be opposed. I heard one guy said, because his wife was a preschool teacher, he said, I know I'm never going to get invited to be on this board. And he was a person that exhibited a lot of influence before that. So he was telling us exactly why he was against it. So that's some thoughts. So you have to make this transition to a single board at some point, and sooner the better.
So you've talked about the Abden model, and then the kind of single board model you're talking about. I've heard it called policy-based governance. Give us just kind of a definition. What's policy-based governance? And is policy-based governance the only kind of single board model that you're talking about?
Right. So when you look at boards or governance in general, there's blue ribbon committees, advisory boards, and a bunch of different structures. But if you wipe out all the ones that are there for fundraising or for other means, and just talk about single boards that have authority over the organization, there's three different kinds. There's managing boards, governing boards, and navigating boards. So managing boards are making the decisions. Or they make all the big decisions. Or they micromanage and get in the weeds and make all the small decisions. And if you're an all-volunteer organization, that's what you have to do. And then if you have staff, and especially professional staff or a larger organization, a bigger budget, and trained professional staff, at that point, your board is basically a bunch of volunteers trying to oversee trained professionals. And so switching to a policy-based approach works a lot more smoothly, because what policy-based basically does is say who makes what decision. And we do that by laying it out in the board policies. Here's our ends policies. Here's why we're here, what direction we're heading. Make progress to those. Here's limitations policies. Here's how we're going to hold the organizational leader and the staff accountable. We are the accountability group here. We have the hammer. That's what we do. We're going to make sure stuff doesn't go wrong. Navigating boards are where you're in a situation where you're operating in a turbulent environment. So, for example, when you look at technology companies and businesses, the people on there aren't writing a policy manual. They're talking about the industry and making a decision about, for example, with Microsoft, should we get out of the cell phone business? Right? So those are big decisions. And they're trying to help the company navigate the turbulent environment. And so the people invited on those kind of boards are people who have led organizations like that, or are expert in the industry. For a governing board, you want people who can govern, which means stay out of the details, stay on a higher level, and just generally oversee the organization. And managing boards, you want people who are small business owners, middle manager type of people who are basically running things happening right now.
Yeah.
So managing boards are dealing with, how we're doing what we're doing. And when you switch to policy, your timeline needs to go out beyond this year. So if you have an annual budget that's already approved, and you got an annual ministry plan that's already being executed, you don't have to go in and talk about those things. It's already approved, they're already working on it. So what about next year and the year after that? That's what policy-based boards should be focused on. For a congregation, you really only switch to navigating mode if you're trying to decide whether or not to close. You can't write a policy on that. You have to make some decisions. You have to distribute assets. You have to decide whether or not to merge. At the board level decision, it's not a staff decision.
Well, you said a lot there, and I love that because, this is a big number swing we're talking about when we talk about mid-sized churches. We're talking about anywhere from 150 to 800, right? And so at 150, traditionally, you've got one full-time staff person, maybe a few part-time. You've got some volunteer people that you're using as volunteer staff, versus you're hitting that 400, you've got more full-time staff. You're hitting closer to that 800, you've got a lot of full-time staff that you're working with. And so you've seen policy-based to be good for kind of that big size range, or where would you start shifting from managing board to policy-based board?
Yeah, so the first church consultant, Lyle Schaller, said when your worship attendance is in between 400 and 800, that's called the zone of turbulence. And where you're not a small church anymore, but you still have small church thinking and small church behaviors. And you get 400 to 800, and the organization becomes way more complex. So, for example, there's a big difference between if you got 60 people in worship and someone comes up and says, "Pastor, can we do a potluck next month?" And when you're 700, you can't do that. You shouldn't be even having potlucks. Right? It's a whole different thing. And so in between 400 and 800, what you're experiencing is 800 barrier issues. So there's a number of moves you have to make in that. And one of them is switch to a single board of directors. And if you have all the ingredients, move to policy-based governance. So it empowers the staff to make the decisions on the ground that they need to make.
Every large church that was in the 1,000, even 2,000 membership range, they were all led by administrative hair pastors, every one of them. And now all of those churches are either non-existent or small.